Ottawa County has many great natural features, but the two biggest and most prominent are the Grand River and Lake Michigan. And Ottawa Sands happens to be right at the confluence of both of those.
This region that we refer to as Eastern Lake Michigan is home to this Grand River coastal corridor. And it's really this amazing jewel of an ecotone. It's the transition zone between habitat types that creates habitat and food and cover for so many bird species.
Where we are sitting right now is part of the coastal dunes area that's very unique to Western Michigan, very unique to the United States, and somewhat unique in the world.
So it's at a key and strategic location for the ecology of both the river and the Lake Michigan area.
So the primary feature at Ottawa Sands is a lake that's about 80 acres in size. It also has wetlands and interdunal wetlands. But then it also has dunes and what we call critical dunes, which are areas in the state of Michigan that are afforded special protections.
Critical duneland is special to Michigan. In fact, Michigan has some of the biggest freshwater dunes in the world. So these systems are very special and unique to our area.
Construction Aggregates was the owner for many years. They go way back, and they of course sand mined it.
Ottawa Sands County Park is unique in that it's a former sand mine.
Sand varies a lot around the world, as most people don't realize. It varies between here and Lake Michigan, which is a mile away. The sand here is rounded, therefore it was used in the casting industry as a mold release, and the rounded edges made it release the molds. So this sand was shipped to Muskegon, to Detroit, where the casting mills were.
Well, the property was always on our radar. It didn't seem to be practical for us.
If you look at our parks plan from a long time ago, we identified a very small piece of this property that we hoped at some point maybe we could acquire enough to connect a trail through here to our other properties.
The Parks Commission had been looking longingly at this property for years. We thought the owner would want to maximize their returns by selling lakefront lots or building million-dollar homes or condos on it. Construction Aggregates finally wrapped up their mining and they stabilized the site in about 2013.
We knew that it had a new owner. We started talking with his consultant, Phil Johnson, and Phil was kind of encouraging us to think about it.
And so that was the first big step, because we never thought we would have the opportunity. When we looked at the site, it really was a great place already. Even though it had been mined, the previous owners had done a lot of work to revegetate and stabilize things and make a great platform for the additional work we wanted to do, both in terms of recreation and further habitat enhancements.
This was really good news and we were all really happy about it, but uh-oh, how do we come up with the money?
The Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund was our only hope. April 1st of every year, get one shot at applying for a grant. That deadline came and went. It seemed kind of hopeless, and I know I even had one of my staff say to me, "Why are you still working on this? You know, there's very little chance this could happen, or maybe no chance." And my thought was, let's just see how it plays out. Well, Phil actually was making progress with the owner, and then he also had some inside track with some of the trust fund officials, and he invited one or two of them out without us being there, but just wanted them to see the site and see if they were interested in it.
Phil said, "Please come over, I want to show you this property." And he helped to convince them that the highest and best use of the property would be a public park.
Things kept proceeding along, and all of a sudden it turned out that they encouraged us to submit an application after the deadline. And that was just so improbable.
So we did the first auto cycle grant. Usually trust fund grants are due on April 1st. We actually applied in November of that year, and then they decided in December.
Once we decided that this could work, the owner told us, I'm only going to sell the whole property. I'm not going to split it into pieces and do it over 2 years. And of course, the trust fund, they said, we can't give you $8+ million in 1 year. We got to split it over 2 years.
They said, if you come up with 25% matching grant, then we will come up with half of it this year and half of it next year.
And so we were in a bind then. How are we going to acquire it? Because we didn't have the money.
And that's where the Land Conservancy came in to help with Ottawa Sands. We were able to help secure the project and enable the county to wait for that second half of funding.
Yeah, we were really fortunate that the Land Conservancy was willing to do that. They took a big risk. And then, of course, the big thing was when the owner himself decided that he would donate 25% of the value. I mean, that was just huge. I mean, that was a very generous move on his part. If the trust fund would give the grant at 75% and the owner donates 25%, we're getting the property just for paying the closing costs. And that's the way it played out. And it was very fortunate for us.
We closed on the second half in 2019, and then 2020, we kicked off our master planning process.
Ottawa County Parks prides itself on projects that are sensitive to the environment, that really balance people's access to the property while maintaining what's special about them. And we also pride ourselves on talking to the public to see what they want.
Part of the master planning process was really kind of protecting and enhancing those opportunities for people to experience the park, but then also doing reclamation and restoration throughout.
They really went above and beyond on this one. They had numerous meetings. They surveyed people. They had a Facebook presence.
I was retired by that time. Of course, I watched it very closely, and I was really impressed with Jason and Kurt and the rest of the team.
We went through a full process like that, even though it was during COVID, so that made it a little challenging to actually meet with people, but we actually did. We had some outdoor events where we invited the public to come in and talk about ideas for the site and what they would like to see and maybe what they didn't want to see, and that was very enlightening.
Really important, and has been for a long time, that Ottawa County Parks meet all the requirements for ADA, but go way beyond that as well, just to make sure the properties are usable and enjoyed by everybody in the community. I know that the Parks team really took that seriously as they looked at this property. And you know, you take the walkway around the lake, for example. That was a real trudge in the sand before then, and nobody really likes walking in sand, even if you're able-bodied. So this is going to be a real joy for everybody of all abilities to come out here.
When we were discussing the concept of a campground, people were talking about a swimming pool and RV sites.
Most of our residents did not think that was a good idea. They loved the way this site felt, the experience they've had here already.
Let's do something different. Let's do something that's not obvious. Let's keep it limited. Let's do something that you can't find anywhere else.
And we instead did the camping we did, which is much smaller scale and unique.
What we ended up with was a yurt village and a treehouse camp and a walk-in kayak camp for people that are adventuring on the Grand River with their kayaks. And all of those things are tucked behind a dune so that when you're in the central part of the park, you don't even see the campground.
In 2020, as we were in the midst of our master planning process, a relative of the Idema family was coming out for a tour. They asked, well, what is this, here? And we said, well, it's this idea we're thinking about called outfitted camping. And the family had visited Mongolia, and we're really, really excited about that connection to the yurts and wanted to fund that part of the project. And then they were fascinated with some of the renderings and conceptual drawings we had of the tree houses in the master plan. They wanted to fund that component as well.
It's just wonderful what the Ottawa Foundation has done in terms of supporting the whole Grand River Greenway with a major donation. But then when it came to this site here, for them to step up and offer to fund this Ottawa Explorers Camp, it just creates such an amenity that the parks really wouldn't have been able to pull off on their own. And so it's a real wonderful gift.
So at the end of the day, it was just shy of $3.5 million from the Ottawa Foundation. Through that funding, we were able to leverage 2 state and federal grants to really help get the park open.
So it really was a collaborative effort, and that's why we've been able to secure even more funding from folks like Audubon Great Lakes, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. All of those have seen the value that this kind of project can provide on not just the local level, but a state and even national level.
I think we all, me included, are thrilled when areas are mined, our sand dunes are special, but the reality is they were doing it to provide a product that everybody needed, whether it was foundry sand or whatever. But at the same time, for Ottawa County Parks, we're looking for bigger tracts of unique, high-quality natural land. You take Ottawa Sands, for example. This property never would have been here in one piece if the mining company didn't own it and hold on to it. The mining company had left it in a good state in terms of the ecology and so forth. They had taken it to a point, and then the parks took it further once they owned it.
So we began working with Ottawa County in early 2022. Our job was to work with Ottawa County and an entire science team that included the DNR, our Michigan State Extension, the Audubon Society. We all worked together to conceptualize what restoration in the park might look like.
We have a sand mine lake here that where most visitors come in and see this open expanse of water with the dunes behind it, they see pristine wilderness.
It may look pristine, but that's aesthetic, and aesthetics aren't everything.
The sand was nutrient poor. There was a lack of aquatic vegetation. There was a lack of woody habitat structures. It did not serve the ecological function that perhaps it could.
And the first question that we ask ourselves is, where are the critters? Where are the birds? We started doing bird surveys in the area to find out what the populations were. Not finding what we'd hoped we would find, the site really lended itself well to restoration for their habitat needs.
In a natural lake system, you often see a shallow area along the shoreline that has relatively warm water and is vegetated, which we call the littoral zone. That's where fish and amphibians can reproduce. It's where they can find food and cover. It's considered generally a very highly productive part of the lake because even though it's geographically fairly small, there's a lot going on there from an ecological standpoint.
So it had very steep sides that were measured and found to be a lot steeper than a typical healthy lake.
The restoration of the lake shoreline included creation of a new, wider littoral shelf around a fairly large portion of the lake.
So we softened about 3,300 linear feet of the lake, doing a lot of earth moving, really just excavating.
But then also installation of approximately 20,000 native plants and installation of about 300 woody habitat structures.
That structure really helps to provide habitat, especially for small fish that are otherwise vulnerable to predators.
If you go to a natural wetland and you look at the structure of it, you have these fingers of marsh that come out and interplay with the water, and you have these backwater areas where the trees fell down and you have the vegetation mixing in there, and this really replicates those features nicely. It's amazing at this point, there's so much detail and work that went into this that you can't really see it, that because where the water level is covering some of those shallows that have been created.
It's almost good it's a little shallow.
It is, because a wetland is a dynamic system, right? It responds to those changes in water levels, and when the water level is static, that's when you have the ring around the bathtub wetland where there's just cattail on the edge and no interplay between the vegetation and the water. So these shallow areas of microtopography will really create that emergent marsh that we're looking for in the future. I imagine this will be a really hot spot for bird and fish activity.
So the lake is the most obvious change, right?
We've also actually just created new wetland areas.
Interdunal wetlands are a relatively rare plant community.
There are wetlands in some of the surrounding dunes, and we use that as a model of what a healthy ecosystem would be like.
So we looked at their size, we looked at their shape, we looked at their water levels, we looked at plant species, and we used that data as an ecological template to help guide our wetland designs for the new interdunal wetlands at the park. You know, there's certainly people in the community that would believe that Ottawa Sands should have been just left alone. But unfortunately, the site was impacted from historic mining.
So everything we've done has been trying to make that a better, more vibrant and healthy ecosystem.
When the master plan's completely built out, 8% or less will be developed. 65% of the site will undergo some sort of reclamation or restoration efforts, and 35% will undergo extensive, heavy restoration efforts.
Most of the restoration projects that take place at our parks, volunteers have helped really on every level. So especially with projects like this, there's quite a few volunteers here, but there's also a ton of space. So when we have a project that has this much space and so much work to do, we really need a lot of hands to help us get that done. So without volunteers, we really couldn't do projects on this scale with the resources that we have.
A lot of waterfowl on the lake today. Don't always see that. When I was in my early 20s, I was out here just hiking for fun. I hiked north towards this property, not knowing really what was back here. And then I looked out over this whole area, and it was mined out and flat, and the conveyor belt was sitting there by the lake. And this little tiny lake was just beginning. And yeah, it's changed a lot since I was in my early 20s, but it's changed for the better.
So it's really the continued collaboration between the state and local governments, environmental organizations, the mining companies, and the community that makes public spaces like this possible.
The scale of this was mind-blowing. If Parks hadn't been able to pull this off, then I think the owners probably would have sold it to a developer. You know, once it's developed, it's pretty much gone forever. And then the bald eagles wouldn't be nesting there. And the migratory waterfowl wouldn't want to stop there on their way north and south. It's just a huge difference.
I would say this is by far the greatest ecological coastal acquisition I've ever seen. And to have a single wide open place like this go into public ownership instead of getting taken over, it's an incredible victory.
It's really a pretty sentimental project and park for me because I've been involved with it since the very beginning, almost.
I got into this field because I wanted to protect the natural resources that I grew up loving. It's something that for me becomes more than just a job, it becomes very personal. My daughter's 14 years old, and see her wanting to become an ecologist now and wanting to go out and hike in these parks and look for salamanders and ride her bike. It's It's incredibly fulfilling, and it's something I never want to take for granted.
So it's one of the biggest projects Ottawa County Parks has ever done. To get to the end point where you can see people enjoying it, people understand what you're trying to do, and you know it's going to impact people for a long time. This was really a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We've invested a lot in it, but we believe it's worth it because of the generational impact it will have for our community.